Hello everyone. It's good to see you here. Today we have a virtual discussion on the topic potentials of political curating during crisis. And the talk will be moderated by art historian and cultural theorist Margaret Tali. I have to mention that it's important to bring out this event is part of the official finissage of the exhibition Thinking Pictures, which will be on tomorrow as a last day in Kumu Art Museum. So the exhibition Thinking Pictures was already in work from the year 2016, and it's a collaboration project with the Kumu Art Museum. The curators of the exhibition are Liisa Kailula, Anu Wallace, and Jane Sharp from Kumu Art Museum. And initially, it was supposed to be a dialogue between Baltic and Moscow artists in the 1970s and 1980s. But a few weeks before the opening of the exhibition, Russia started a war against Ukraine. And this dialogue took on a totally different context. And as the second half of April, the exhibition at first the exhibition opened totally empty, devoid of any artworks. So the places where the works should have been, we had this kind of gray shadows, and we had all the etiquettes and wall texts, but all the works were missing. This was in a sense a really conscious act by a museum and curators, and we saw it as an anti-war protest by our side. And from the second half of April, the exhibition started to fill with artworks. So around from every 2 weeks, selected set of works were installed to the exhibition hall. So because of this whole situation, museum wanted to organize a discussion on this mentioned topic. And today we look into what kind of strategies have curators and cultural organizations and museums found for dealing with this kind of sensitive topics and this sensitive context. And maybe what kind of collaborations do we need in cultural field to tackle this kind of subjects today. So I will give just shortly a word to our curators, Liisa Kailula and Anu Warsza, so they will introduce this exhibition a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitta. So yeah, me and Anu, my name is Liisa Kailula, and this is my colleague Anu Warsza. We are the two curators of this show. That really had a very bad timing because we were supposed to open the show on the 17th of March, which was 3 weeks after the war started. So it was really a very difficult moment to open an exhibition which was dedicated to the dialogue between the artists of Moscow and the Baltics. But Brigitta, basically, I think told you pretty much that the main content she already gave you. So what can we add? It was a research exhibition that started in 2016 in the Kumu Art Museum when me and Anu were there to make research about this famous collection of Norton and Nancy Dodge. And this is how it basically started, as a very nerdy research project. We had no idea that we would end up, opening the show in this context, which meant that we really had to make these curatorial decisions really fast in a very difficult moment where all the reactions here in Estonia were, of course, very emotional.
Yeah, maybe it's just good to articulate once again what was the problem actually, because it's the historical exhibition. Nothing has actually changed in terms of history. The history is still the same, and we didn't want to. We stand behind our exhibition. I mean, this is what we wanted to do, and in the end, what we did. The problem was that the exhibition was entirely built on the dialogue between Moscow and the Baltics. And even if the dialogue in the 70s, 80s obviously happened, we don't want to somehow challenge that or deny that. It was clear that in today's context, it was, I think, for us the first time when you see that today's context or what's happening today changes the perception of history that much that you can't not react to that. Somehow it had to be addressed, because if we were talking about it, that if we have this 5 minutes to explain what it is, of course we can explain it, and I don't think that anyone would be against showing those particular Russian artists. But we knew that there will be a situation where we don't have those 5 moments. 5 minutes, so and this opportunity to explain something. So this kind of the dialogue, it was also in the title, dialogue between Moscow and the Baltics, and somehow we felt that we need to at least somehow address it or change it or create some sort of connection between what happened then and what happens now. And the second problem was that is slightly more ambiguous problem even, is that the ways of communication in this time's culture, in 70s, 80s, the stagnation time, and the ways of communications today are so different that there are certain works at the exhibition that are, so to say, double-coded, which means that they are made in a certain way, and everyone in this context, the stagnation time Soviet context, understood what is meant by them. Like it's a hyper-realist Lenin image, for instance. And everyone understood at this time, but today they are just, they are not necessarily, they could be misperceived, misunderstood, and we didn't want to make those artists represent something that they never wanted to represent. So it was kind of, we tried to protect the artists in a way, or at least not put them into some sort of vulnerable position where they would be attacked for something they never meant to do. So these were the two main problems, why we had to do something, rethink something, even if we had all options on the table. We had at one point there was also the question whether we would cancel the whole thing, which we obviously didn't want. There was also an option that we do it exactly as we wanted to do. And somehow it turned out that it's not possible or at least not wise to do it, and not so much because of the context, but the content of the exhibition, but because of the context of it, because of today's context and this to certain sense, this sensibility that war has created. So this is why we did what we did.
But also maybe I just want to add that, of course, we had to take a stance as an Eastern European museum too, because especially now it is very clear that Western European museums have not really made this kind of statements, right? They are pretty much continuing their business as usual. Maybe they have cancelled a few Russian shows, but I think as an Eastern European museum, we really had to make a strong statement because we here still remember, the Soviet time, and I think we really had to stand strong in solidarity with Ukraine. So that was also one of the main reasons why we decided to do this, which was highly extraordinary for us too. We never experiment like that usually. Kumu is working, making its program 5 years ahead, really preparing slowly and doing doing shows for a longer period, but then suddenly we had to work in a totally different mode. Yeah, we decided to go for it because as an Eastern European museum, I think we just couldn't continue normally our work the way that we had been working before the war.
And that's it. We don't want to focus. I think the idea of this discussion is not to overly focus on our exhibition. So we have talked about it too much already. So we would now be silent and let you talk about. But this would be the starting point, I guess. So and let you talk about other things too.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa and Anu and Brigitta, for this introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful day. In Tallinn, it's perfect beach weather, so we're fortunate that people are willing to make time. So the question we decided to focus on as a part of this discussion is to imagine and consider the ways in which art field can react to the crisis around us. Russia's war in Ukraine has been continuing now 5.5 months, and this has affected Eastern Europe very alarmingly, because instead of being about rising prices for electricity and gas, here this crisis also concerns our memory culture and our sense of safety. So Eastern Europe clearly has something to contribute to understanding this momentum, this time that we're in, and I think it's important that we use this momentum. So this crisis has led to revisiting of public memory as a part of this decolonization process and rethinking the long-term influences of Russian imperialism and the Soviet era. And we also shouldn't forget that this war comes together with the corona crisis and the growing concerns for the climate change. So what can curating do? How can it tackle these problems and contribute with its sets of tools and competencies? We hope that people will participate and bring questions and comments, and that we can learn from each other's perspectives, both with the speakers and with the audience. And of course, there are already initiatives tackling this situation, and this is also a chance to learn about what is already being done. And I'm very glad that we have 4 excellent speakers who have agreed to contribute. So I will introduce them briefly before we start. So Lia Dostlieva is an artist, cultural anthropologist and essayist from Ukraine, who is currently based in Warsaw in Poland. And the primary areas of her research are trauma, post-memory, and the agency of vulnerable groups. Joanna Warsza is the co-curator of the Polish Pavilion in the current 59th Venice Biennial, titled Re-Enchanting the World, by Polish Romani artist Małgorzata Miergatas. And she's an independent curator, program director at CuratorLab at Konstfack University of Arts in Stockholm, and editor of many publications in the fields of art, politics, public sphere, and performativity. Originally from Warsaw, Joanna lives in Berlin now. And Francisco Martinez is an anthropologist and curator. Since recently, he teaches at social design in Estonian Academy of Arts. Francisca has published several books, most recently ethnographic experiments with artists, designers, and boundary objects, and curated several exhibitions, most recent of which is Life in Decline in Estonian Mining Museum in Kohtla in East Estonia. And finally, we have Inga Lāce, who is a Central and Eastern Europe Fellow at MoMA in New York. Since 2012, Inga has been a curator at the Latvian Center for Contemporary Art, where she has co-curated the Survival Kit, a festival of contemporary art in Riga, the exhibition Portable Landscapes shown in Paris, Riga, and New York. And in 2019, she co-curated the Latvian pavilion at the Venice Biennial with the artist Taiga Grantina. So we'd like to encourage everyone in the audience, as I said, to actively participate and contribute. And I will read the questions, so you can type your questions in the chat throughout the program, and we'll find moments to bring them in and do our best with it. So to start, I would like to bring the question, how do you see that curating could contribute to the cultural field and to the society in the context of war? And perhaps we could start from Joanna, if that's okay.
Yes, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, it's a very, very complex and difficult question. I don't think there is one correct answer. It's a dilemma, basically, because on one hand, when something major like a war is happening, of course, I guess we share a feeling that what is art in relation to people's life? You know, like is there even a place for art? I think that's the first instinct. And also it was the first instinct at the beginning of Corona crisis and the isolation period. So I guess this comes first. But then when the conflict continues or the situation of a crisis continues, I guess we also start to realize that art maybe not save lives, but it might situate it ontologically. It might give it some, it might be a form of ontological survival. It might give some meaning. It might situate us. It might bond us together in a way and bring a necessary dialogue, because life continues despite. So I think it needs a lot of careful thinking, a lot of gut feeling, basically, a lot of listening to each other. But there is need for art to be continued within very tough and political circumstances. And one example of it would be also the fact that if we look back at the Second World War today, in many schools, I guess all across Eastern Europe or in Europe in general, we do study literature that was created in concentration camps. So this literature was created despite, you know, the most atrocious circumstances, and yet it becomes kind of a witness of this time of a language of exchange. So that's we need to continue, but we cannot continue undisturbed. We can continue only being disturbed by this situation.
I remember, Lia, towards the beginning of war, because we have been collaborating in the course of last 2 years. You expressed this in, I think, in social media, that you don't see a way to continue your work as an artist, but you do see chances to talk along and to contribute as a curator. So it would be really interesting if you could tell us more and to know also if you still share, if it's still a valid position at this point.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, that's right. And I still have this feeling that that as an artist, I'm somehow stuck at the moment when the war started. So I work now more like, I don't know, participants in discussions, or also as contributor to, I don't know, different media outlets or so on. And yeah, and back to your question about what can curatorial field contribute and a deeper understanding in the context of art, I think that I would like to narrow this question as much as possible. I would like to narrow it down to context of war, context of Russian aggression on Ukraine. And I think that when we are talking about this new iteration of Russian aggression, because war hasn't started at 24th of February, it's been going on for 8 years on a very different scale, of course, but still. And I think it's very important to highlight that there is nothing new about this Russian genocidal desire to erase Ukrainian identity, as well as identity of other former colonial subjects, and this desire have been very present for centuries. So it might have a different form now, but still we have this prohibition of Ukrainian language during the times of Russian Empire. Also, I would like to quote Wallace's circular of 1863, which stated that a separate Little Russian, as they used to call Ukrainian language, never existed, does not exist, and shall not exist. And their tongue used by commoners is nothing but Russian, corrupted by the influence of Poland. And also later was introduced the Ames Ukaz, which completely prohibited the use of the Ukrainian language in open print. Or also, I can briefly mention that, for example, the whole field of Ukrainian ethnography and ethnology was perceived as purely political field, because it was very dangerous in 19th century, as well as during Soviet times, even to state that there is something like Ukrainian ethnos. And later then, like Soviet power established itself. Soviet Ukrainian ethnologists and ethnographers were executed among other Ukrainian cultural elite and in 30s, and now we call this event and this whole generation of executed historians, artists, writers, poets as executed Renaissance. And it really hurts me that I have to talk about my culture and about my cultural elite in terms of the death of the whole generation, not only in terms of the art they presented. And also, I would like to share my screen now. Okay. Give me a second. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know how to make it like bigger, but I think you can see it anyway. It's a picture by Ivan Padalka. You can see beautiful women full of life who are picking tomatoes. And you might think that there is nothing like special about this picture, but what is really special about it is that it was created in 1932, which is a year when the Great Famine, Holodomor, already started, and like people were actually dying from the starvation. And Ivan Padalka creating this beautiful picture. So, for example, if we present it without given context, without deeper explanation of historical context, it would be impossible for audience to understand what was happening and how complex was this cultural background in the given time that prominent representative of Ukrainian cultural field have to create this unthinkable propaganda style picture in order to somehow survive, in order to help himself, which didn't happen because he was executed in 1937 with his teacher Mikhail Boychuk, among other representatives of this so-called executed Renaissance, as we call it. Yeah, so I think that curatorial practice is a good way to highlight these narratives, to explain people deeper meaning behind some pictures or some facts, which are given without deeper explanation, could be understood in some very different way. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lia. I would turn further to Inga to hear of your perspective. How do you see these possibilities to contribute?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for organizing this discussion. And so I think one realm is indeed the representation in the exhibitions and collections of museums, and of course other institutions and cultural forms like biennials of, you know, not only Ukrainian artists, but also the kind of more complex problematics, as Lia also explained. So it's not only important to show images, but also to sort of create narratives around them. And I will really maybe speak a little bit from the position of a museum, because I am sort of a Central Eastern Europe fellow at MoMA in New York, in a museum located in the West. And so there was a wave of quicker and more immediate solidarity exhibitions and events that has taken place across, you know, Europe and the world. And then my question would be, how can we continue these collaborations in a more sustainable way, sort of knowing that there is a fragile and extremely precarious context in Ukraine and also in Central Eastern Europe, because of the, let's say, fear, for example, and how to not again be extractive, but actually to have this dialogue on an equal basis, you know, and collaboration. So really, in terms of museum, I think it is museums in the West, let's say, that I sort of represent, even though being from Latvia and right now being in Latvia. And I think it's really this research and research in collaboration with practitioners in the region to understand the complexities and entanglements that are in the region of Central Eastern Europe historically and now, and to think maybe also about emancipatory practices, about practices of resistance, and you know, also historically and currently, and how can we support them, and yeah. And another thing, like for instance, we could just think about one, you know, moment in art history, which is Russian avant-garde, and how, you know, one way to think about it differently, that maybe, you know, that Russian avant-garde was, you know, artists from Latvia, from Georgian background, from Ukrainian background, and also traveling, migrating, influencing each other. And of course, things happen not only in Moscow, but also in Kiev. And for instance, when, let's say, writing that art history, maybe instead of looking at hubs like Moscow or Paris, then one could look at Kiev and Tokyo, like to really kind of redirect the art historical narratives. And I'm mentioning Kiev and Tokyo just because I recently had a conversation with an artist friend, Nikita Kadan, And we talked about David Burliuk, a Ukrainian avant-garde artist, who together with another artist brought an avant-garde exhibition to Japan, and that kind of kickstarted the avant-garde movements in Japan. And basically to sort of, so there is a historic direction and historic actual event that could be explored and supported, for example, with a collection to talk about it, sort of, to not only create some sort of imaginary or artificial narratives, but and another thing which is more than curatorial, I think it's actually really financial support and really thinking like how within those collaborations it's actually that solidarity which is also necessary. Like you just need to acquire works, you need to do those collaborations so that or provide residencies as a space for artists to be safe and to create or not create, and to really, I think that is also very important if you think about sustaining cultural, practice and dialogues that can be, possible in the future.
Francisco, on to you and your ideas and thoughts.
Thank you for the invitation. The social role of curating is a never-ending discussion, and it has to be, because we are always working with different constraints. So there is a need to renew or update our awareness of the limits and impact of our work, as well as of the context. So I very much appreciate this discussion and the need of it. Curators often are more or less working for institutions. Like in my case, I work for a university nowadays, an art school, but most of you work for an institution. So that makes us closer, so to say, to the police than to the revolutionaries. And institutions always have their own agenda. So we have to decide what kind of institution we want to become, because to some extent that's unavoidable that we hold that responsibility and wear that hat, as British people say. That brings also the possibility of taking the critique inside the institution or the institutional framework, like intervening. Also, that shows that curating is much more than selecting art or meeting artists. Indeed, different theorists or critics or art historians have defined curating in a wide range of possibilities, like from a knowledge event. I have listed here just 5 or 6. Curating is a knowledge event, Rogoff, a way of testing out reality, Obrist, a practice of mediation, O'Neill, a form of hospitality from Bismarck, a technical infrastructure, Dominguez Rubio, a way of exploiting artist work, Serovek, a contact zone, Pratt, a social laboratory, Sharon McDonald. And I could go on for 2 hours with different definitions of what curating entails. I believe that the important gesture here is to always reconsider the impact of our work, the where, how, with him, and for whom of what we do. But we have to be careful with over-promising, because conveying a message is just that, conveying a message. And making visible things does not imply that people will be concerned and even less take action for what we are, let's say, communicating. The same with the whole world is watching. The whole world is watching to forget soon after. So we have to be always aware of the limits of what we do. And just to finish this quick intervention, there is another thing that is important in my view, which is to distinguish politics from the political. Like politics entail institutions, in the sense of, the institutional organization of society, political parties, institutions of powers. Kumu can be one of them. But to be political or to talk of socially engaged art, it means to challenge or address these very power structures. To be political entails intervening in them or engaging with them, causing trouble, disagreeing when required, or refusing to do what one is expected to do. And they both are complementary, and they both are part of what democratic politics can be, and therefore they both are important. Margaret, I could go on, Margaret, but I think it's good to continue with the discussion.
Thank you so much for all your thoughts. I think, well, generally speaking, there's been a lot of kind of emphasis on putting or expecting the political from artists. So artists should be the ones who take risks. And there's been, like, curating has been much more of a safe ground. But speaking from Estonia, I also see that there is a willingness of institutions to engage and go further and take some of these risks in this social situation we are in as well. And of course, there are also, like, some of these thoughts that came to the fore related to research, and Inga was suggesting looking into alternative narratives. These are all these require very long-term work and a lot of resources. And as we know, often the resources we are playing with are rather short, and they don't allow to, pursue many of these visions. But I wonder whether there are also initiatives that you could bring out that you are aware of the current practice, which have engaged with the war in ways that are inspiring and active. And they could be either long-term plans or also shorter-term engagements. And anyone who would like to bring things out can open their mic. I remember, Joanna, you were also sharing your experience from Manifesta, so extending this conflict in a similar way, like Lia reminded us we need to do. So I wonder if you could, or if you'd like to share your experience from that context. And talk to the openness of institutions, also taking, looking a little bit further back.
Right. Well, what I have learned from this experience being in Russia, in St. Petersburg in 2014, during the annexation of Crimea, is that very often institutions, when confronted with such major political events, actually don't have capacities, and maybe it's changing now, but don't have really capacities to react immediately, because their prime concern is PR, stakeholders, everything but not art when it comes to a crisis. They kind of self-consume, and they are busy with their own image and existence. And that was a bit a case of Manifesta, who couldn't, as an institution, react fast enough with positioning towards annexation of Crimea. Eventually it did, and also that was a little bit my dilemma in that situation as a curator of public program, a dilemma of engagement, or what I call engagement or disengagement. And it was a very complex situation, but the whole program I've been curating with the artists of Eastern Europe have been changed to comment or to speak of the annexation of Crimea. So, for example, Christina Norman, a beautiful film together with Ukrainian artist Alevtina Kakidze, was created as an effect of it. But anyhow, what I have learned is that many of the institutions are actually not considered art as their first mission or content as a first mission, but themselves. And this is, I think, what the huge crisis like this one maybe can also make them rethink. And we do, of course, have good examples. Inga, you have spoken of some of solidarity actions, but also how the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw was immediately engaged, and part of it was turned into kind of a reception solidarity center for the Ukrainian incomers, and many of them also culture workers. So in those moments, institutions could think of themselves also as sheltering places, as places, with water and heat and some infrastructure that could be curatorially, like place of hospitality, you said, could be used in the state of emergency, so to say, and it's being done. And also another historical example linking to the current project that Inga is working on is the museum in Malmo that after the Second World War actually was turned into a refugee center and has received a lot of people going out, liberated from concentration camps that were coming to Sweden on so-called white buses. And some of them have been hosted inside the museum. And a very interesting situation also occurred, because while they were sleeping and being received and in the first moments after trauma in the museum, they were also looking at the objects which are there. And for example, some of them have organized a holy mass with the historical crosses that have been on display at the museum. So in some sense, museum is usually mortifying certain objects, and these objects have been performatively reenacted and used. And that was a really interesting historical encounter between what a museum can do in terms of hospitality, and what can it do also symbolically, and how it can react ontologically to that situation.
Yeah, maybe just to continue, what Joanna said, really, I think there are many initiatives, especially in Warsaw, in Poland, as one of the neighbors of Ukraine. I also recall visiting recently Biennale Warszawa, and they were showing how their office had also become, or their spaces was like 2 floors, had become center for refugees for a while, but also specifically for BIPOC refugees, because there was also this moment of how there would be certain refugees that are more welcome than the others. So like refugees of color would always face more problems or more, severe maybe restrictions because of their passport also like not being Ukrainian, for instance, and Europe still being the fortress Europe as it is. And then I'm thinking also, just one example that comes to mind is, let's say, one museum or art center that and hosting another and having that exchange, where there is Muka Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp, who have had already a collaboration with the Pinchuk Art Center in Kiev. And then just, I haven't seen any of those projects, neither in Brussels nor Kiev, but sort of one institution becoming a temporary host for the other, let's say Muka hosting people from Pinchuk Art Center, and creating programs in Brussels that talk about the war, that represent and show Ukrainian artists. And then Muka also sort of, when a similar exhibition or let's say a different exhibition is organized in Kiev now during the war, then Muka would be lending works to the spaces of Pinchuk Art Center, let's say in Kiev, with this idea that probably works cannot be insured at this time because it's a war zone, but probably, and obviously it's also a very important like symbolic gesture. And I think, I'm sure there are more examples. What I'm thinking about, yeah, again, is quite art historical from my perspective at the Museum of Modern Art and MoMA, is that they usually work with on the symbolic level, like working with the collection. So for instance, I think it's really, I could mention another example. So for when, you know, Trump was banning entry for people from certain countries, like I think it was Iraq and some others, they would immediately bring up the works from the artists from those countries, as in saying, like, without saying, but with art and with these gestures saying, well, these people are welcome, they have always been here, they have to be here. And then this time when the war started, a gallery in solidarity was put up, so somehow changing another gallery, and works were put up from the, you know, previous century by artists born in the present day Ukraine, that sometimes would later go to like Paris or Berlin or Moscow. And we know those names sometimes as French artists like Sonia Delaunay Terk, or we know them as Russian artists like Ilya Kabakov or Kazimir Malevich, or we know them as American artists like Louise Nevelson, or as Ukrainian artists like David Bulyuk and Maria Sinikova. And somehow that gallery, on the one hand side, it shows that, yeah, like this is Ukraine, this is its territory, but it's also that it's also very transnational. People have been born there and they have migrated. Of course, sometimes that transnationality comes because of the wars or because of pogroms or other, you know, horrible events. But it's an interesting example to think, yeah, what art history can do. But again, on this is still on the art historical and symbolic level, but yeah, I think it's great. And then at the same time, it also was a moment when MoMA as an institution realized that, well, yeah, and then there are no, let's say, contemporary artists to be put in dialogue from Ukraine with those artists. And then we did the contemporary artists video program also, who are not in the collection, and then thinking further, okay, so how can a strategy be developed in order to continue sustainably acquiring these works and you know, working with the region. So I think that really can shake also some things in really large institutions. Yeah, and they should be shaken, I feel.
It could be that for some of you, it wasn't enough, but I actually enjoyed the visibility given to Ukrainian artists in the Biennale in Venice this year. And I think it's an important gesture, like to provide resources and time and space for that. Also, Margaret mentioned before the need of for Eastern European cultural institutions to decolonize themselves, and to somehow become platforms for public discussion. And that there has been already a tradition in Western Europe for that, and Western European institutions are going through that critique. But in Eastern European institutions, there are other issues to help to resolve along with these ones, such as lack of funding, constant ruptures of projects not being sustainable, as Inga mentioned before, as well as over hierarchical structures, outdated authoritarian practices behind closed-door decisions, and the need for more parity of representation, more transparency, becoming more participatory or inclusive. So it's very difficult to ask for all of that at once. I mean, processes that took over, that have been going on for decades in Western European institutions, are supposed to be resolved in a few years in Eastern Europe, along questioning the very category of Eastern European or post-socialist institution itself. On the other hand, there are in Estonia already colleagues that are aiming at inspiring alternatives. I mean, doing art activism. I don't consider myself as doing art activism. My projects have been political without being activist, because of art activism has to inspire alternatives, build communities, foster dialogue, eventually change things in a socio-material way, not only discursively. In Estonia, there are Eirik Trisberg, Eleonor de Montesquieu, Christina Norman already doing that. Also, other names come to my mind, like Lina Siib, even Rebecca Polsam or Kirill Tulin have been doing something similar. However, it's not fair. I don't consider it's fair to put such responsibility on the shoulders of individuals, artists or curators. Also, in some cases, we have to be suspicious of that attribution of responsibility, because actually those who have the means to deal with these issues transfer the risk and task to justify their non-intervention. So we have to be critical with this way of privatizing risk, which is the ABC of neoliberalism. And perhaps an extension of this, and just to conclude my intervention, is to pay attention to the fate of these conceptualist artists that are exhibited in the beautiful exhibition by Anu and Lisa, which is like 50 years ago. They were non-conformists. They were questioning the totalitarian Soviet state. And nowadays, these individuals somehow have become to represent, or have, because of the changing political context, they have become somehow unwelcome figures in this context. And their work is the same. Their political standing, non-conformist, critical, is the same. But we are asking perhaps too much from these inspiring colleagues who were already questioning the system 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I wonder, Lia, if you could bring out, I'm sure you are aware of many of such initiatives also based on your artistic work that you continue to show, created before.
I actually wanted to mention that this kind of catastrophic events, such as wars and other bad stuff, always create a need to reconsider the language we use while we're talking about something. And for example, very recently, I was also invited to by Warsaw colleagues to discussion on somehow relevant, very same topic, same-ish, and it was they used the term post-colonial while talking about very same issues. And I asked them why actually we're talking about post-colonial context and not about decolonial. And actually this discussion started before the discussion started, because we started to talk with each other. How do we understand what is colonial, what is post-colonial, what is decolonial, what can be used, and how could we talk about this context? What's actually happening? And as I mentioned before, like for me, for a person who came from this very eastern territory of Ukraine, from Donetsk, which was occupied already in 2014, this war is not a new thing. And when annexation of Crimea happened and when the war in the eastern part of Ukraine started, we also started to think about proper language, how we can talk about these events. Because in terms of social change, it was pretty obvious, because we have this massive few millions of people who were internet displaced, but if we are talking about them not in terms of basic needs, what had happened to them. And sorry, I'm going to share again, I think. Yes. I'm going to briefly mention our exhibition from some time before. It called Reconstruction of Memory, and we invited artists who came from these occupied territories to think about what actually had happened to them, what actually they lost when they lost their homes. And we showed it in Prague in Docs in 2017, which also was very useful in terms of spreading information and raising awareness about the war, because some people were already like, oh, do you still have your war? What exactly is happening there? Yeah, and we asked our artists to think about language, think about proper terms we can use about when talking about those events, what actually happened. And we call this project Reconstruction of Memory, which was kind of manipulation, because it's pretty obvious is that you cannot reconstruct anything, not in form it was created before, at least. And here you can see reconstruction of Crimean beach, which we made from the stones, the small pebbles we asked from friends, friends through social media, because when people, like virtually every Ukrainian visited Crimea at some point of their life, and everyone have this had these small pebbles from Crimean beach at home. So we asked to donate us those pebbles in order to create this place of memory, but in a very physical, literal way. Yeah, and also you can see a work of Sergei Zakharov, who recreated his apartment. It's not very visible on this photo, but actually you can look through the window and you can see a real view from Sergei's apartment, but pre-war, before the war started. And if you don't know what's happening there, I mean, it's just a random view from the window, you would never guess that it bears very big personal meaning. Yeah, and another thing I wanted to mention briefly is our workshop we held in Vilnius during this exhibition, which is still there. And it's called Is It Colonial? And we showed some pictures from media, from Soviet era, from urban environment. For example, like this one, when you can see representatives of Soviet republics dressed in folk costumes, and also you can see the Russian guy who is dressed in more like neutral costume, less folk, and also he is holding this rocket in his hand as a symbol of science and knowledge. And you can tell that this representation is very colonial. And for example, this picture is from Polish city Poznań, and you can see it's barely from Soviet era, I think it's 60s. You can see here Russian poet Alexander Pushkin, who is shaking hands with Polish but also Lithuanian and Belarusian poet Adam Mickiewicz. And here also you can see a Polish soldier who's shaking hands with Soviet soldiers. So, I mean, Russian culture has been instrumentalized as a weapon for years. And we briefly talked through these issues with audience, and then we asked our audience to decolonize those pictures in any ways they feel is closer to them. So we ask them to create some kind of collages. So you can see this picture where this Russian guy is cut it out and he's holding Pushkin instead of rocket. And there is another one with Litvoichizna Moya, which is a poem by Adam Mickiewicz and Что делать, as in Russian, and also some other pictures created by participants. Yes, so yeah, I think I will stop.
Could you hear me, Lia?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So I was wondering how, what was exactly the kind of assignment of what did you ask the participants in this workshop to do to understand this kind of route from these images to the works that you shared that they produced in the course of it?
We talked how could we possibly decolonize this way of representation. How could we create something different from these pictures? How could we address the issue? And it was just kind of exercise when people getting this understanding that it's okay to talk about the issue. It's okay to interact with such imagery. It's okay to cut it out, to create something entirely different from that. So, and it was mostly teens with some adults in terms of the audience.
And the workshop took place as a part of the exhibition Difficult Past, Connected Worlds that we've curated with collaboration with colleagues Ieva Stachowska and Egle Mikalajune in the Vilnius National Art Museum. And actually, as a part of this experience, we didn't somehow change. We changed a little bit of the framing of the exhibition as an outcome of this experience of the war and its starting, but it has been mainly actually the educational programs which took this as a starting point. So this was kind of speaking from a curatorial point, our starting point for doing something around it and bringing some artists to tackle and to communicate with the audience. I wonder if there's other reactions to this, what Lia shared, or other thoughts. And just to mention also, if anyone from the audience has a question, please feel free to type it in the chat and we can read it, or a comment. We can read it out loud. I mean, there's a lot of experiences that's been brought to the fore, and also these actions of solidarity, of course, are incredibly important. And Inga, you mentioned about you brought the forward to the question: how can how can we continue these solidarity actions in a more sustainable way? I wonder if somebody wants to talk to this, and one of the questions also I'd like to raise is the subject of collaborations. What kinds of collaborations do we need, and which are not happening right now, but that could allow new aspects to be brought to the fore about this crisis, or ways of seeing our situation as being political, and this politics articulated in new ways. Please feel free to open your mic and talk to this.
Yeah, maybe I can just start. And thank you, Lia. I think it's actually a great workshop. It's a very good, in a way playful, but actually really serious way to maybe explain what this decolonization should mean, that visually, with your hands and cutting and pasting, and because sometimes these are such abstract concepts, and also the question whether this is really also decolonization, whether it's really the right word, whether we should maybe think about other words entirely, and not to tap into that colonial, post-colonial, decolonial discourse. But I'm using it for the lack of better words. But I think this is really the moment to both for ourselves and also for the other world somehow to realize and acknowledge Russian imperialism as a form of colonialism, and also Soviet Union in that same matter, because before, often too much, it has been seen as this very emancipatory post-national project that, of course, it also strived to be, and it produced different kind of art that we are looking at. And it's not that we should totally dismiss it, but as many artists are doing, or art historians are thinking about it, how to retell this story or reshuffle a bit. But this summer, I've been in the super inspiring visit to Central Asia, and that somehow for my own work and for my own research, it has really made me think of how I had never been there before, and somehow it has made me think really about the whole post-Soviet realm, or from the Baltics, that I'm thinking a lot about, Ukraine, Belarus, and South Caucasus, where I've done research before, and Central Asia was really new, and whether somehow a new approach of how we could, collaborate, work across, really work transnationally through these issues of post-Soviet, post-colonial, decolonial, maybe looking at really this shift of 80s, 90s, and then comparing it or bringing it towards the contemporary practices. I think that kind of voicing or dialogue should be really important. But at the same time, it's always also been, I guess, and there have been projects that have been done with titles like progressive nostalgia, or somehow implying that there is a certain nostalgia towards the Soviet time, which clearly now there isn't. And I think that our generation can really bring those new narratives in how to work across. But also I think we have to acknowledge that there has been such kind of inequality within those countries and hierarchy that were part of the Soviet Union also, because Baltics have always been the Soviet West, and then Central Asia has always been the Soviet South, and in the moment when the Baltics were having their environmental movements, and being against Soviet infrastructures like dams and metro being built. It was also against workers from other Soviet republics coming in. So it was clearly very nationalist and racist at the same time. So I think there's still many things also to maybe talk about across our, countries. And yeah, and so I'm like really thinking about this book of Diana T. Kutai-Bergenova, written towards nationalizing the regimes, conceptualizing power and identity in the post-Soviet realm, where she compares like Latvia and Kazakhstan, like two opposite ends of how countries dealt with nationalism, and like renewing their nation states after the Soviet Union. So I think like something like that can be feasible, but it doesn't have to be Latvia and Kazakhstan. It can be different kind of cross collaborations. But it yeah, and then of course it's a question of resources and sustainability, but that is kind of this more like things that I would like to see be done, and or like do sort of myself. And also thinking about that there have been different non-aligned movements in the past, and what can be done, what can be learned from those solidarities, because often the problem is also like with the war in Ukraine, that often marginalized groups are somehow being pitched against each other, sort of, and that is also something that would have to be addressed, I feel, sort of like why Ukrainian refugees are more accepted than others, but it's not entirely, it's at all not a problem of Ukrainians. It's a problem of Europe and Fortress Europe, and then how we as Eastern Europeans can, what can we do in that, in actually to have that discussion, that it's also not isolated from other processes and other colonialisms and other imperialisms. So maybe that is something for the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. I see that you'd like to add something, Joanna.
I would like to comment on the issue of collaborations, which I believe is very important, because what we care for as curators and the way we work, the way we do things, has both social and epistemic consequences. It influences, on the one hand, how we see reality or how we invent the world, but also it influences visitors. I mean, I believe that exhibitions have the potential of influencing the way people organize their work or their life, and that leads to paying attention to doing curating in a more dialogical way, taking risks together, even if we play different roles and hold different responsibilities, but involving artists and designers in decision making, eventually also the more kind of dialogical communication with the audience. Or, I mean, there is not a new discussion. There have been like participatory art, relational art, but still we have to be updating constantly these forms of doing things. And there is this beautiful Italian term, aggiornamento, which means also this precisely updating. So we have to, as curators or as cultural workers or art workers, we have to be updating the way we are available to others. And that is influencing the way we see reality, and eventually that is perceived by visitors to our exhibitions. And I am aware that good intentions are not enough to produce positive outcomes, but this is a small gesture that often is perceived by others, from collaborators to audiences.
Can I ask a follow-up question to this really interesting statement? So how do you understand this availability to the others, to be available? What does it mean?
It can go from unlearning your own methods. Me as an anthropologist, when working with artists and designers, it takes a lot of effort to unlearn what I know and meet them or create a common ground that make them feel not to be sacrificing their agenda and priorities and notion of relevance, for example. What is relevant in terms of knowledge and in terms of outcome, for me, as an anthropologist, is not for a designer or an artist. So I have to unmake my tools and unlearn my epistemic techniques in order not to oppress my collaborators. And that has been, there is a lot of learning, and I am thankful to my to the colleagues I have been working with, mostly artists, also designers, for their patience, because it takes patience from all parts. Being available also entails making time and space and providing resources / money for them to make this effort. And there have been cases in which I have been told, like, what you are talking is not relevant. Why are you paying attention to this? Or there have been cases in which I have been told that I am just the curator. I am the artist. Why are you making so many suggestions? You are just the curator. And it entails an awareness that also frictions and tensions are unavoidable. In some cases, they are productive. In some others, they are very annoying. But I mean, I believe you are also aware of this as professional curators.
Thank you.
And Joanna, would you like to take up, to continue and say a bit further about the collaborations you see as being needed or welcomed?
Well, maybe following on this tension question, you know, I think it's always hard to go for a crisis, either on personal level or institutional level or political level, but just to have some kind of affirmative approach to this, if possible, is to see the crisis as a possibility to rethink our roles, right? Rethink the game we are playing as curators, as artists. So it's a very distressful moment, but maybe we can also use it, as this discussion is aiming for, to think how we can use you know, what we are doing to other ends. It's a bit general answer, but since you asked me, I will also ping pong back, because actually I was, Margaret, very curious about how you asked us at the very beginning how to use this momentum from Eastern European perspective. And since you as a researcher have been dealing with decolonization in Eastern Europe for many years, what would be your answer to this question?
Well, as we have produced an exhibition which very much talks to these subjects in collaboration now with Latvian and Lithuanian colleagues, I see this as a chance to further the conversation, take it to new contexts, create new educational programs, new interventions around it, and use this as a platform through which we could continue. Because I mean, there are such exciting artists that we've brought together from all over, like, let's say, the broader Baltic and Eastern European region, and they are the questions they are raising are extremely relevant. So I really hope that we manage to find venues and spaces in which this exhibition can continue into, and that this could be the kind of broader, this way of expanding and engaging new people also. So yeah, I guess that would be my answer. And because the exhibition in Vilnius is still up, then I guess that also maybe limits my own imagination, because this is an ongoing project. But yeah, I hope that not only to Eastern Europe, but perhaps also to Germany, to the Netherlands. But we need to find these spaces and these collaborators, and that's not a very easy process.
I would like to briefly mention that Eva Stachowska is curating an exhibition entitled From the Post-Colonial to the Post-Socialist in Riga. The opening is the 1st of November. And we are producing an art installation. I say we because there is Anna Skodenko, Daria Popolitova, and Viktor Gurov and myself, based on visiting basements, like cellars, on the border between Russia and Estonia, and talking to people about the kind of things they keep and why. And there have been a lot of learning based on this experience, as well as tensions and people talking about the war in different, positioning themselves in different ways. And also I'm learning because of these three guys, these three inspiring colleagues. They are artists and I am not an artist. So I have been very jealous of the way they visualize things, and I am incapable to do so. But in any case, you all are invited to visit the exhibition in the Riga Art Space in a few months.
And I believe that Inga is the second curator of that exhibition, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I was at the kind of very initial stages of that project, but I had to leave it because of yeah, I mean other projects and other work.
I see. And Lia, what about you in terms of this subject of collaborations? As we were talking, what kinds of collaborations do you envision would be productive and important?
I think almost everything was already mentioned here. I just maybe say that I think that's a very productive way of collaboration when we invite to work together artists, but also curators, but also anthropologists, but also someone with historical background. So we do not lose something important in terms of narratives, in terms of bigger story. Yeah, and I think I should say we have to know each other. We have to get to know each other better, like other former colonial subjects, and establish new links between us. It was what Inga already mentioned before, and I really want to go to Asia because of my personal story, because my great-grandmother and my grandmother, when she was little, were refugee in Uzbekistan during Second World War. And for example, what I remember from my childhood, from their stories, then they talk about local women, then they would wash their hair and decorate it with cotton flowers. And it was a big part of my childhood memories, these stories about cotton flowers. And then when I grew up, I understood that, like, for me, this cotton flowers was like integral part of this idea of Asia, of Uzbekistan. And then when I grew up, I read some kind of literature, and I understood it was nothing like native about it. It is Soviet power who like made these countries to start to produce this cotton, to grow cotton instead of their like gardening and everything. And it was also like this sign of oppression and not a part of like an initial native landscape. So yes, I really would like one day to go there and to explore it and to create, I don't know what, story, project, something from it. Yeah, that's maybe that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if Lisa and Anu have anything that you'd like to bring in or react to.
Well, maybe I would like to shortly come back to the question of what kind of decolonization do we need in Eastern Europe? Perhaps that's the main question, because it's very clear that the war has kind of stirred things up, and decolonization has suddenly started to mean something else, because it used to be, at least here in Estonia, when we talked about the need to, you know, decolonize our art histories, it meant that we had to, you know, get rid of the Western influence that was kind of suffocating. But now we are talking about the same. We're talking about decolonization as a tool to get rid of the Moscow dictate, or to kind of shift the geopolitics in Eastern Europe. So in that sense, I also, to be honest, I see a danger here that when now, you know, for example, with our show, there was a review by a Ukrainian artist, and she was exactly kind of praising us for, you know, decolonizing the art history of kind of, you know, pushing aside the strong Moscow influence. But here in Estonia, we haven't had this kind of problem for the last 30 years. It has been a bigger problem has been, you know, the influence of the Western epistemology and theory and terminology. So I kind of maybe want to throw it in the air again, that if we start to kind of decolonize Eastern Europe now, meaning that, you know, we need to decolonize it from Moscow, then we might forget that we actually need to decolonize it from the West still as well. That's the thing that I wanted to maybe add to the discussion here.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I was thinking about the same when listening to Francisco, or I had similar thoughts when listening to Francisco about your comment about the museums and the museums in Eastern Europe needing to learn from Western institutions, or do do similar kinds of collaborations, practices as in Western Europe. But I think that's not at all what we need. We need to reinvent and what Joanna was saying, rethink our roles, both within institutions and externally to it, in relation to this new situation, because definitely the war is bringing a whole new dynamics, which at the same time is very known from history to the fore, and this putting it in perspective of a longer history, but also thinking towards the future is very important for this curatorial field and the field of art history, humanities more generally. So this has been an incredibly productive 1.5 hours, and I've taken a lot of notes, so a lot to process, and I'd like to thank you all for being part of it and contributing. I hope either through Kumu or in other contexts there'll be occasions where we can continue, because the decolonization is definitely a key word, and there's many connections to draw, not only within Eastern Europe but also more globally. So yeah, I'm looking forward to continuations, and many thanks for this. For joining on this Saturday afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Congratulations to Lisa and Anu for the exhibition.
Yeah.
Yes.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
You have the
See you around.
you have the for those in Estonia, you have the last chance to see the exhibition
Exactly.
tomorrow.
Tomorrow is the last day, and then we pack it up.
So use the chance.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Margaret, I think I did perhaps, she's away.